It's time for the Granada Forum radio show. Right now, live on air with your host, Granada, Wendy.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. Wendy's had to make a quick trip down to the airport, driving a friend of ours, making sure he got on his plane. So I'm the other host. This is Nick. Don't everybody applaud at once. Anyway, welcome to Revolution Radio. We're the #1 commercial-free, listener-supported internet talk radio station in the world. You find us at freedomslips.com or revolution.radio. I don't have much by the way of announcements as Wendy is used to doing, but just to let everybody know, we are going to be at the Cancer Control Society on September 1st. That's going to be over at the Glendale Hilton. You want to give them a call and find out how to get tickets to it, you can give them a call at 323-663-7801 or go on thecancercontrolsociety.com. Frank Cousineau, a friend of ours, he's the one who's running it. And if you go in there and you spend the weekend there and just listen to the speakers, it's well worth it. I met G. Edward Griffin there, and it's really worthwhile trying to get everybody involved in getting alternative treatments to cancer, because basically the ones that we are told work really don't work all that well. So anyway, let's get on with everything. So John wanted to make an announcement. He's a regular of ours. So John, go ahead and take it away.
Well, thank you, Nick. The reason I decided to make an announcement that's not related to politics is because there's a movie coming out by the name The Meg.
Hold on 1 second, John. If you can, is there a way for you to get more volume into your microphone? We can barely kind of hear you.
Well, this is about the best I can do.
That's a lot better, believe me.
Okay. There's a science fiction film coming out called The Meg. I think it's just been released in select theaters. I'm not planning to endorse it, but it is bringing up a topic which is of some interest to me. It is based on a shark that supposedly was extinct millions of years ago, and because it is science fiction, they're trying to indicate that through some catastrophic event or some rather weird phenomena, it came back into existence. Now, there are many different opinions about the Meg. Some people who have done studies on fossils believe that it may have reached a length of 60 feet in length, which means it was a rather massive thing, and its tooth would have been about the size, the length of your telephone receiver if you had a landline, and triangular shape, just like the great white has on a smaller scale. Now, if you have been doing any research in recent years on the great white shark, they indicate that it only grows to a length of about 20 feet. Now, I can tell you that yours truly, when he had an encounter with a great white shark approximately 59 years ago, that it was very massive, and I estimated its length to be at least 30 feet, if not 35 feet. In fact, when it came to the surface, I assumed that it was a miniature submarine. It had a whitish metallic gray dorsal fin about the size of a rudder of a small Cessna aircraft. It was fairly massive in size. And miraculously, being further offshore than the shark, as it turned out to be, it was a miracle that I was able to escape, because the very next day it was reported that a skin diver, Portuguese band further up the coast near San Pedro, was killed by a great white shark. In all probability, the very same one. Now, what bothers me, when I was in the Coast Guard Reserve, we had an opportunity to visit El Toro Marine Air Base when it was in operation. And for some reason, we had an opportunity to have a conversation with a Marine helicopter rescue pilot who worked here in Southern California on rescues, as well as the Coast Guard and other agencies. And he recalled at the time, a situation whereby when he made a rescue, or attempted to make a rescue, that there was a large cabin cruiser, probably of what you would call a yacht classification size, that was broken into two sections by a massive great white shark. And in all probability, that so-called great white shark was more than 20 feet in length. And it is also mentioned that these ancient megalodons, megalodans,
megalodon,
could grow to a length of at least, on a conservative side, of at least 35 feet in length, which would be closer to the length that I had encountered. But you have to understand that the only other sharks that marine biologists are aware of are sharks which are not carnivorous of that size or magnitude. So it is very possible that the shark that I encountered was not a true gray white, or else it was a great white that was very old. They can live to be at least 60. I believe that a great white shark can live to be over 100. That's my personal opinion. And just like they're uncovering sea monsters that supposedly have been extinct for millions of years, I think there's a very good possibility that a shark similar to the Meg does still exist, probably within the length size that I'm indicating, or else the great white shark is able to grow much larger in length and magnitude than what?
Well, actually, the great white sharks are estimated to be able to grow to a length of almost 30 feet, somewhere between 25 and 30 feet. But the biggest difference you're ever going to find out between them is the size of their mouth. The megalodon, they actually have a photograph of 5 scientists sitting inside the jaws of a megalodon, and it still didn't take up the entire thing. So, you probably saw a very large great white, and if you encounter one, they're probably going to look a hell of a lot bigger. I mean, I know that if I stare down the barrel of a gun, that barrel looks a lot bigger than it is.
Yeah. Well,
so,
what I'm able to do is estimate distance and size pretty well. And I realize under such an emotional, stressful situation such as that, there's always a possibility of distortion on the part of the would-be victim. But
right.
Considering the fact that I was level-headed enough and a miracle happened and I was able to escape, I think my estimates of size are fairly accurate under the circumstances. Of course, we know a lot more. In all probability, that shark circled me at least once underwater before coming to the surface for greatest ramming speed. And the only chance that I had was not to swim away from it, but swim towards it because it was closer to shore than I was. And they say that these sharks, the great whites, can swim about 35 miles per hour, which is pretty fast on the water. And to be hit by something at that speed can incapacitate.
Yeah, they would definitely gain size. All right. Well, thanks for sharing that, John. That was really good.
The only
now,
reason I wanted to share that is because I don't think the general public is being told the truth about the great whites. California has considered them to be an endangered species, which means they are protected.
Well, nobody's ever told the truth about the great white, especially since Jaws came out. And when Peter Benchley wrote that book, everybody got freaked out about it and started trying to off them in record numbers. And the fact of the matter is they're an absolutely necessary top predator in the ocean. You wipe them out, and pretty soon you're going to see a lot of other things start the snowball effect anyway. But anyway, thanks for sharing that. And I'd like to move on and get our guest on, Libbe HaLevy from nuclearhotseat.com. Libbe, you there?
I am, and thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you. By the way, if anybody doesn't know, Libbe HaLevy has been on our show before. She's from nuclearhotseat.com, and she just had a book come out called I Glow in the Dark. Did I get that right?
It's actually, Yes, I Glow in the Dark.
Oh, Yes, I Glow in the Dark, which, by the way, just hitting pretty good on Amazon.
Yeah, we had quite an exciting day. Yesterday was launch day, and there are lots of ways that people fiddle around with their listings so that they're in some obscure listing. They go, oh, I got to Amazon #1. Well, I didn't do that. I just went for honest listing in my category, and I got to number 17 on the bestseller list in my category, which was really terrific. I mean, Nelson Mandela beat me. That's okay. And the other thing is that Big Amazon has a list of over 8 million books on it. And we peaked yesterday at 7,751,
nice.
Which is extraordinary. Yeah, for anybody who's not backed by a major publishing corporation, to break the Amazon top 10,000 is extraordinary. And we went way past that. So there's lots of interest in the book and what's in it, and I'll be happy to tell your readers a lot about what's in it and also what's going on in the nuclear world. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, let's start this. Let's go ahead and give us a little bit about your book. Tell us what's in it. I mean, because I read the synopsis of it, and it had to do with 3 Mile Island and all of that going on. The only thing I remember about 3 Mile Island is what I heard in the news when I was growing up and driving by there on the way to Washington, D.C., and seeing the amount of cars that were leaving the area.
Yeah, all of that. Well, the full title of my book is Yes, I Glow in the Dark, 1 mile from 3 Mile Island to Fukishima and a nuclear hot seat. And the reason the reason all of this has happened is because I was living in California, but went east to visit an old friend of mine who had just moved with her husband to a small town in Pennsylvania. And when I arrived, she told me that I had really come to a great place to cool out because the town she lived in, Middletown, she said, Middletown is really middle town. Nothing important ever happens here. And 5 days later, 1 mile from the home in which I was staying with them, the nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island began its process of melting down. And in that time, we were not really that aware of it, and there were lots of assurances happening. So we did not evacuate until the 3rd day. And by that point, there were announcements going down the middle of the road saying, stay indoors, don't go outside unless you have to, stay away from your doors and windows. I was in a place without transportation. I was a visitor there. They had no basement in which to hide in case the thing exploded because we didn't know whether it was going to explode or not. It was an experience in ultimate terror because being alone in the house with that kind of with a leaking nuclear reactor just down the road, I mean, within vision, within sight of where I was staying.
Did they even sound the sirens when you were there? Because the one thing I do remember about growing up in Massachusetts is I didn't live too far from the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, and they would run every once in a while. They would test those things, and it would howl for hours. So I'm just curious if they would actually set off the nuclear alarm sirens while you were there.
I did not hear them, though I was told that in Harrisburg, someone, and they don't know who, it was not authorized, but someone took it upon himself to set off the sirens in Harrisburg. But where I was, it was true. It was a little area called Royalton, which is the subdivision that is closest to 3 Mile Island. And I heard nothing there until I was alone in the house. I was writing. The day before, I had played the game of freelance writer because I was a freelance writer. And I figured, I'm close to something that may or may not be a story. It just sounds like media hype. And I go walking around in Middletown and interviewing people and breathing deeply of the Pennsylvania springtime air, not knowing that they were releasing radiation and that I was in the plume. None of this was known at the time because they were either hiding information or they didn't have the information or they were putting out false information. I mean, it was a combination of many things. Right. I have to say that back then, the nuclear industry was at the very beginning moments of coming up with the playbook of how to handle any and every accident, leak, spill, whatever, in terms of dealing with the public. So right. They were not as slick as they have since become in their handling of this. But it was an ultimate trauma in my life. It absolutely changed my life. My friends were able to come and pick me up, but not before I was alone in the house, having heard that warning. No transportation. There's no public transportation. I didn't have a car. I couldn't hide from any kind of radiation. I grew up in the 1950s, so I remember all about hearing what radiation would do, except back then, the assumption was that radiation was going to come from the bomb, and it was going to come from the Russians. So we were given honest information because it was such frightening information. You don't hear that information now because it's not that the radiation is going to come from a bomb. It is already coming on a regular basis with regular releases, right. Even without accidents, that are happening at nuclear facilities everywhere. There's not a single one that doesn't have it. Right. And the fact that you grew up around Pilgrim, I would pay very close attention to my health.
Believe me. We used to have some rocket scientists at my high school, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, some of these guys were absolutely brilliant. You could tell how well they did in things like chemistry and basic science classes. And our school used to have a Geiger counter. I don't know that any school has those anymore. But
I don't think so.
You would see every once in a while that thing would start to spike. And you would, somebody made the call down to the power plant and said, hey, guess what? Our Geiger counter down up here, which is 15 miles away from the power plant, or 10 miles away from the power plant, we're getting radiation spikes. Is everything going on? Okay, that's going on down there. And they would go, oh, yeah, everything is fine. Thank you for keeping us informed. Those are the times that those sirens would never go off.
Of course not.
The only times the sirens would ever go off is when, we're just testing them, Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can't even imagine what I'm pretty sure they probably had a shutdown when 3 Mile Island was happening.
I can't speak for the sirens because I was a visitor in the area. I wasn't familiar with anything. I don't know what was normal there. But I have spoken with many people since then. With Nuclear Hot State, I've been in continuous weekly production for over 7 years now, since 3 months after Fukushima. And in that time, every year when it's the end of March 28th is the anniversary of 3 Mile Island, every year I do a special. And I have a whole series of interviews that I have accumulated about what happened there to people who were in the area. And they were talking about the metallic taste in the mouth. There was a local school where they did have a radiation meter. And the morning of the accident, they saw that the radiation meter was pinging. I mean, it was pinned all the way to one side. It couldn't measure any more radiation. And they called, the teacher called the State House in Harrisburg and said, hey, we've got this radiation thing happening. What's going on? And they said, don't worry, we're on it. We know all about it. Well, they didn't know all about it, but they were pretending to. And I mean,
of course.
Of course. But the thing is that the proper follow-up has never been done to 3 Mile Island. Let me back into this, back away from that, and just tell you that my book hangs on the experience at 3 Mile Island and how it shifted my entire life. But it's a storytelling exercise. I'm not trying to be the world's greatest expert in, subatomic particles and how they operate. But it's about what I learned growing up in the 50s, leading up to 3 Mile Island, the impact that had on my life, which even before anything physical started showing up, there was this enormous emotional devastation that happened, and post-traumatic stress, and absolutely being mule-kicked out of the life that I had been living, because it was impossible for me to do it anymore. Because when I was alone in that house walking around, I didn't know if at any moment that thing would explode. I didn't know, even if it didn't explode, did I already have enough exposure to radiation that in essence I was already dead? At one point I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and started counting down to see if I could figure out the exact moment when not only my life, but life as we knew it on this planet was going to disappear. I mean, these are heavy psychological weights, and nobody knew how to deal with it. And I didn't know how to express it, so I damped it down as best I could. But basically, it made me pretty much a non-functioning individual for a long period of my life. And I couldn't even become an activist because the post-traumatic stress was so big that I couldn't focus on this thing. And nobody seemed to want to talk about what the accident was, only here in Los Angeles about the big fundraising event that was coming up, and all of the... I'm sorry about that. All of the, I'm sorry, I lost my thread.
What is it? What, like protests or something that were going to happen, or?
Oh yeah, no, there was at the Hollywood Bowl. There was a big demonstration, concert, big stars, and all of that. And I went into the Alliance for Survival, and I said, look, I was at 3 Mile Island, and they said, great, stuff envelopes. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. They all wanted to get their own place close to the stars who were going to be performing and going to be speaking at this event. And I was forbidden from saying anything to it. I did work the event with the media, but I wasn't allowed to say anything about my own experience. And shortly thereafter, I just realized that when I got into these situations where there were quote unquote anti-nuclear events, people weren't focused on nuclear. They were there for the concert. They were there for the selling of the shtick, the beads and the jewelry, and I mean, and everything would have these little icons on it that looked like the cooling towers. And every time I saw them, it would like trigger my post-traumatic stress, and I end up being a nervous wreck.
It was a money-making event for them, and that was it.
It was not consciousness raising. It did not do, I don't know that it did that much that was political, but it gave people a feel-good something to do. And it's fine. Those things are fine. But I was in still such a horrible place in my life from this that it took me the better part of about a year and a half before a psychological protective denial device that I had automatically manifested for myself, where I was like I was imagining myself in my life, and I had really died at 3 Mile Island, but this was the flash forward. Instead of flashing back and seeing my life in review, this was seeing my life forward, and at any moment I would be back there. It took a year and a half before that cracked open, and suddenly I was back in my body and back in the current moment. But from that point on, I had virtually nothing to do with nuclear unless it intruded upon my life, and then I ignored it again as quickly as possible. I ignored Chernobyl. It's like, I know what it's like to be afraid of nuclear. I didn't want to hear other people say they were afraid of nuclear. I knew what that was all about. You go have your experience. I've already had my experience. And that was pretty much it. I did not see China Syndrome for years. Could not make myself go to see that film because it terrified me. What it was going to do. And indeed, when I first saw it, it freaks me out in a big way, but that was already something like 10 years after the event had happened. So, I mean, there's a lot of this where I was one of the people who was walking around not paying any attention to these issues, even though I might have had a reason to do so. And then Fukishima happened. And it was like if 3 Mile Island mule kicked me out of the life I was living, and it did, Fukushima mule kicked me right back in, and I went into overdrive and was writing articles. I was on podcasts. I was talking about what I knew about nuclear, which I thought was this great amount, not knowing how much I didn't know about it. And then about 3 months in, I just got the hit to do a podcast on nuclear. And I didn't know how to do a podcast. I was not an expert. I didn't know what to do, but I figured, okay, fine, I'll give it a try. This was like some kind of like a spiritual message that I got. You will do your first podcast this Tuesday. Okay, fine. I guess I'll do a podcast on Tuesday. And posted on Facebook, did a conference call. 2 people got on the line with me. And they before I was done talking, they said, hey, this would be a good thing to do. So I went, I'll do it once a week until I'm tired of it, until I don't need to do this anymore. And that was June 14 of 2011, and I've done it every week since then.
Okay, so what in the end results of it? I mean, I haven't read the book yet. Like I said, I've read the synopsis, and I have a basic idea what was going on with 3 Mile because I was around when that happened. But what have they done as a follow-up to 3 Mile Island? Anything at all? As
little as possible.
Of course.
And my book is not completely every piece of 3 Mile Island, because it's a memoir. It's a story of my life, but it's how nuclear impacts a human life. And then there's a lot of stuff that I've learned from 3 Mile from nuclear hot seat that I include as well. But at 3 Mile Island, they did no medical follow-up. They didn't even try to do a medical follow-up until 5 years after. And at that point, more than 50% of the people who had lived there at the time of 3 Mile of the accident had already moved away. They were never followed up upon.
Right, of course. And 3 Mile Island was before the whole Karen Silkwood thing, right?
I don't know where that goes in proximity. Possibly, probably, but I'm not an expert. I don't have that information readily available to me.
Okay.
But the cover-ups were amazing. I was just back at 3 Mile Island, Middletown, Pennsylvania, for the first time in 39 years this past March for the 39th anniversary, in part because there was a panel discussion made up of the newscasters who were covering the story when it was happening. And I wanted to hear what they had to say, because the media at that time was not as controlled, manipulated, and brain dead as it sometimes is on nuclear issues now. And there was some very honest reporting that took place under some very difficult situations. But they were talking about being lied to, being told, oh yeah, everything's handled, when it wasn't. One man was a cameraman, a news cameraman. He was in a helicopter over the cooling towers taking footage when the frantic announcement came out, get out of there, they just released more radiation. He's had his health impacted by that. He told me, I met him at this event, and he told me that there's a group of veteran newsmen who, mostly men, a couple of women there, but who get together in Philadelphia 4 times a year. Just, community, friends, talk, catch up, whatever. He said, of those who covered 3 Mile Island, more than half of them are seriously ill, at least the ones that are still alive. And nobody has done any kind of significant follow-up there. More importantly, and this is something that I discovered and that becomes a running theme in the book, and that is that the techniques that are used by perpetrators of sexual abuse to keep their victims silent, to shame them, to manipulate them, to denigrate what they're saying, to poo-poo, you're being too emotional, you're just going to make problems where there really aren't any, you can't prove that, blah, blah, blah. All of the things that a sexual abuser uses to keep the victims silent is exactly the thing that the nuclear industry used at 3 Mile Island and now uses everywhere to convince people that nothing went wrong, that there's no problem, it's all in your mind, you're just being emotional, you don't work in the industry, you weren't trained in this, yada, yada, when what they're doing is covering their own posteriors because of so many dangers. For example, I'd like to give you a point of clarification on what you shared earlier about, every so often your radiation monitor would suddenly go way up in the school and they'd say, oh, nothing out of the ordinary is happening. I talk about this in the book because I go into 2 chapters on what the nuclear industry gets away with and how they get away with it. And one of the things is that they have enormous releases of radiation every time they go to switch out the fuel rods, the so-called spent fuel rods, which are very hot, very radioactive, contain plutonium, which is dangerous for a half-life of 24,000 years. When they periodically have to remove those rods and put them in the fuel pools to cool them down, they have to stay there for at least 5 to 7 years to cool down, and then put in the new ones. During that time of transfer, radiation releases spike and go way high. But the people in the local communities are not notified of this, so you don't know to take any protective measures. And further, the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or as it's known in the trade, the Nuclear Rubber Stamp Commission, what they do is they average out releases from a nuclear facility over a year. So while you may have had a dangerous high spike during refueling, by the time they average it out over 365 days, doesn't look that bad. And it gives them planned deniability of any kind of danger. And that is, okay, I think, what was happening for you.
Right. Well, let me ask you this also, because you touched on something that I thought was actually kind of interesting, was after your experience over at 3 Mile Island, you said, you went on for years without actually, because you wanted to get away from the whole idea of the radiation thing. But since then, between now and then, how much have you learned about how nuclear reactors work? I mean, how much have you actually? I mean, so I've looked at them. That technology is old. It's not very complicated either, but it's we're dealing with technology at this point where it's going on 70 years or more.
I know it's old technology, but I make it very clear that I don't do the left brain technical stuff. That's not me. My background includes show business. I wrote plays and musicals, award-winning ones, got lots of productions,
right.
Taught musical theater writing, and also I have a master's degree in spiritual psychology. So what I'm looking at more than anything else is the human story and where technology intrudes upon human life and where the humans who are in charge of that technology are lying through their teeth, exaggerating, hiding, obfuscating, tap dancing and farting, as Kurt Vonnegut would say, to try and get us to not pay attention to what is happening in the nuclear world. And it is devastating, and they do it on a continuous basis. So other than the fact that, yes, I know the technology is extremely old,
right,
because it was invented before they were built. They were only built to last for 40 years. I mean, that was the understood lifespan of a nuclear reactor, because
right,
the radiation that they get hit with causes something in the metal parts which is called embrittlement. It gets brittle, and when that starts to crack, radiation releases, and then you've got yourself in a potential Chernobyl situation. Maybe not
right,
with the explosion, but in terms of the amount of radiation that can get released. And with that
I was just kind of curious how much of that you actually looked into yourself, just as an interest point. I mean, that's the only reason I looked into it. I just wanted to find, when everybody started talking about, especially like Chernobyl and Fukishima and all the other stuff and how old the technology was, I just kind of looked into to see, well, because I do remember 3 Mile Island and everybody was getting upset about steam escaping, and the stories that we were getting off the news was, well, they used the water to cool down the nuclear reactor. It's like, well, why does that make it bad? And then I looked at the how the heat exchange system works. I'm like, oh, well, that's why it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the way, because the water that got released was not the water that was running the turbines. It was the water that was actually running through the the radioactive cooling rods themselves, and it's not even like regular kind of water. It's called heavy water. So, I didn't know how far you got into the technological side of it, but
no, with nuclear hot seat, and that has been my vehicle for going through this.
Right.
Every week I do a compendium of stories from the week in nuclear news, and this is like around the world, includes Fukishima, includes around Ukraine, but wherever there happens to be a nuclear story. But my goal is to be a translator of this information for people who know nothing, who would like to know something, and people who know something who would like to know a little bit more. Those are the interviews. Right. Those are the interviews that I do, because the interviews are deep dives with people who really know what they're talking about. So basically, I ask a setup question, and then I get out of the way and give them the platform for sharing the information that mainstream media isn't interested in hearing. And I've gotten some remarkable interviews with genuine world experts, not the so-called experts who are, trying to protect their very highly paid jobs. But right. These are people who know what they're talking about. We've got the footnotes. We've got the data. And it's the show is part of creating a platform for which people can visit it and find out what they want to find out about from the people who are actually doing it. For example, one of my interviewees earlier this year, second time I've had him, was Timothy Mousseau. He's the man, he's an evolutionary biologist from, I think it's the University of South Carolina, and he is the man who has been doing the on-the-ground biological research into mutations at both Chernobyl and Fukushima. And when you hear anything about mutations in plants, insects, birds, animals, he's now worked his way up to small mammals at Chernobyl. Anytime you hear that, he is the source of that information because he's the only one who is doing it. And I had him on, and anytime I have him on, he gets the whole program because his information is fascinating and we're getting it from the source. I always try and get us back to a source who can credibly speak to the wide range of issues. And because I'm not a technical person, I get to ask all the normal person, average questions that people want the answers to, and then build it into something more complex. But we always start out at a place where anybody can get on and understand what is being talked about. We don't try and bury it in jargon and lots of languaging. Okay. It's always about, let's make this understandable.
Okay. Well, what's in your end of it, the stuff that you report on for most of all, what is, you're going from like Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, probably San Onofre, imagine, because they just got popped a little while ago.
Oh, my God. 3 of my last 4 programs have been specials on San Onofre and what's going on down there. I will fill you in on that, but keep going on your line of thought.
Okay, I just want to, with all the ones that you have been looking at, and what is the one commonality between them as far as covering up the information goes? Or as a matter of fact, not even just the cover-up, but what is the one commonality between them on what you have found out?
Oh, radiation and denying that it's there. Denying that it has any impact on human life. They have a nuclear power plant.
They have a nuclear power plant, and they deny that there's radiation there?
Oh, well, radiation being released or radiation that is somehow impacting people in health. Oh, no. It's basically, our fecal matter doesn't smell is one way of putting it. This is the way I put it for broadcasting. There are other ways to say it. But it has been incumbent on the nuclear industry from the first to cover up what it is and what it does. And I do a deep dive into that information in the book as well, because I went back to the cover-up that took place with the first test explosion that took place, the Trinity explosion in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And that was covered up because it was this enormous explosion in the middle of the desert that people could feel or see or hear about, 100 miles away. And So there was an embedded reporter from the New York Times, a man named William Lawrence, Atomic Bill Lawrence is what they called him, who was their science writer, and he was brought out with the Manhattan Project to be there and to write a press release that they could release. And he wrote the press release before the explosion, that they could send out saying, oh, there was just this explosion in a munitions dump, nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. So that was already prepared.
Right.
The government, seeing that it had a good thing in Lawrence, kept him on with the Manhattan Project with the bomb leading up to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, at the same time, he was still on the payroll of the New York Times, which is such a violation of ethics. It's beyond the pale. Be that as it may, he was supposed to be in a follow-up plane for Hiroshima, and there was bad weather, and he was grounded. But he was in a follow-up plane for Nagasaki, and he was there. At the behest of the federal government, he wrote a series of 10, you can call them articles, they were really press releases about the atomic bomb, how it got built, what the Manhattan Project was all about. Wasn't the bomb wonderful? Didn't it save lives? All of this. He wrote these 10 articles that were in the form of press releases. They were given to the New York Times, which of course he still worked for, and with just a little bit of editing, they were a series of 10 articles, the New York Times, under the byline of their science writer, that at the behest of the government, again, the New York Times made available for free to any newspaper that wanted it. And the problem with these articles is that in all 10 articles, there were only 8 minor mentions of radiation. There was nothing in there that said, and oh, by the way, this thing is even worse than the initial blast, because if that doesn't kill you, what comes as a result of that explosion will. There was none of that. That was completely covered up. And there was only one reporter who managed to get that story, because, of course, the government very quickly clamped down on the whole Hiroshima and Nagasaki area, and you could only get in with the equivalent of military passports to get in there. And then you were ushered around, you were accompanied, you were never on your own, you couldn't talk to people individually. By a series of, divine intervention, fluke, luck, whatever, this one Australian journalist who was writing for a London newspaper, his name was Wilfred Burchett, he managed to get into Hiroshima about 2.5 to 3 weeks after the bomb went off, right before the total clampdown on access was done. And he saw what was really going on there. And he visited the hospitals, and he saw the people who were dropping dead starting 3-4 weeks after this explosion. So he got the real information, and he managed to publish it. And it was in like 4-inch letters on the front of this London newspaper. I published it. I write this as a warning to the world, talking about people dying in their tracks, dropping dead weeks after the bomb actually fell. He was the only one who addressed radiation, but he was an Australian writing for a London paper, which ran it for maybe a couple of editions on one day, and that was it, up against a 10-article series coming out under the aegis of the New York Times and their science writer. And he actually won a Pulitzer for that series. When what it did was it set the baseline for the world to understand what nuclear was as our government wanted it to be perceived. And radiation had no part of that discussion. And in large measure because of those articles, less than a year later, we were doing atmospheric tests in the South Pacific and nuking the poor Marshallese people, the islanders down there, to the point where they cannot go back to their ancestral lands because they're too radioactive. Most of their elders have died, and there's tremendous illness down there. And we didn't do anything to help them medically. We just kept track of what was going on. So our government was acting like Mengele.
Well, not even just them, but I mean, remember when they did the bomb testing in the Nevada desert? And they would line up like all these troops on there, and they say, don't worry about it. It's just dust. We just want to see what's going to happen. And then when they were doing the test off the Bikini Islands, I mean, where they actually changed the shape of an entire island on one of them in the atoll, and they irradiated all these naval ships, and these guys are coming down with different forms of cancers and other kind of illnesses. And the DOD at the time, I think it was called the Department of War, they're saying, no, that's just from something else. It had nothing to do with us. And it's the same thing that goes on now with all the DU that's been spread around in the Middle East, and guys come back with what they call Gulf War syndrome and all kinds of other illnesses, and they're saying the VA now is going like, oh, it has nothing to do with us, that's something else, and they're denying them medical care. That drives me nuts too. Not to mention all the stuff that they did to all the civilian populations all over the place.
Well, if you look at the cancer rate, which goes up year after year in the general population, they'll say, oh, well, maybe it's the chemicals, maybe it's the food, maybe it's your genetics, maybe it's this, maybe it's... The one thing they never look at and consider and factor in is exposure to ionizing radiation, meaning radiation from nuclear reaction sources. And this cancer used to be a rare disease. Cancer used to be something that happened occasionally. I forget what the statistics were, but back 100 years ago, it was not common at all. But since the start of the nuclear age, cancer rates have been going up. But radiation almost cooperates with the government in the desire to keep all of this hidden, because when they say there's no immediate danger from exposure to radiation, well, literally that's true. Because unless you are exposed to a catastrophic dose, like the people who were trying to clean out Chernobyl were, the liquidators there, who got liquidated themselves because the radiation levels were so high. But unless you're exposed to something that high, it takes years. It takes 3 to 5 years for thyroid cancer to start showing up. It takes about 7 to 10 to 15 years for hard tumors to show up, and then it just continues. So it's time delay.
I think Marie Curie would be a test case on that one.
Well, she dealt with pitch blende, and she had direct contact with it for all those years. And there's a very famous photo of her hands near the end of her life, and they are totally crippled and distorted because she was handling highly radioactive material. But we didn't have this stuff in our environment until the digging for uranium, which exposed Native people in Canada, in the United States, especially the Navajo people, the Dene people, and also in Australia, the Aboriginal people there. These are the ones who were digging uranium. And as is said in the Native communities, you might meet an old coal miner. You will never meet an old uranium miner because they got taken out. And the tailings were left and they blow around and people are contaminated. And as long as it's a population of the power structure in this country is likely to dismiss on any one of a number of reasons, from skin color to heritage to beliefs to the fact that they just don't have a lot of money, so they don't have a lot of power. As long as it happens to them, they're not concerned. But what they're not looking at is the fact that I don't care who you are on this planet, nobody is immune to the consequences of what's been happening with nuclear. We are all compromised. And the compromise is the longer it goes from those original points of contamination, as the levels of contamination continue to grow from all of the various sources, the nuclear reactors, the nightmare that has been created with waste that we don't know how to store and we can't neutralize and is being dumped. I mean, I'll go into San Onofre shortly. But in addition, with all of this out there, we are watching cancer rates going up. We are watching birth defects, autoimmune problems. All of these are known to be caused by exposure to radiation, but nobody's looking, or only the people who are dismissed with the A word, activist. It's kind of, oh, you're an activist. That's why you're seeing something. That's why you're complaining so much. You just got a chip on your shoulder, and you've got a any one of a number of cliches about we've got an agenda. What? You're trying to protect your multi-million-dollar jobs and industry and hide the fact that you're doing irreparable damage to the biosphere and the living beings on it, but you don't have an agenda. The nuclear industry has controlled the conversation for too long. We've got to take back control of this conversation and start using, the real words, the real facts, and that's what my book is about. It's my story, but it's also my story as to how I became educated and empowered. And I take people along every step of the way as to what I learned, how I learned it, and how outrageous it is, and how I reacted to it.
Right, but I think it goes a little bit further than just your story, because at this point, we're all being affected by it. Regardless, if you live within proximity of a nuclear reactor, especially one that's, that's like old and broken down, and they refuse to, to clean it up. And especially when Fukushima blew, I'm not even talking about Chernobyl, because Fukushima blew right on the coast of the Pacific. And that stuff is now sweeping around into the Americas. So, the Pacific Ocean's currents is carrying all that radiation around, and it's going to start affecting us here pretty soon. So,
it's already.
This is not just your story. At this point, it's becoming everybody's story, I think.
Well, that's why I tell it the way that I do. Again, I'm from a theater background, and one of the things we learn in theater is that if you're talking in generalities, the story never lands. It never has impact. It's too general. But in the specifics is where people can follow the truth of what is there and understand what is happening and project themselves into it. So, no, this is not just my story, because it expands out to really be a call to action to anybody who has read the book to take action on nuclear issues, and then I give them some things to do. In particular, next year at 3 Mile Island, which will be 3 Mile Island at 40 years old, and at that point, the media, mainstream media, will pay attention to it. They only pay attention to anniversary. If it's the 1 year anniversary, they might piddle around with it a little bit if it's a 2nd year anniversary. And after that, the number has to end in a 5 or a 0, or they're not interested. Well, next year is 3 Mile Island at 40, and I am committed, and a lot of other people are committed to making this a big deal.
Right, but the only thing they really pay attention to is, hey, did you realize that that one of the Kardashians came out with a new shade of lipstick? We have to promote that.
I don't care about that garbage. They're all.
I know, but that's what the media does. That's what the mainstream media does. All they want to do is talk about. I watch the morning news sometimes, and it really does drive me up the wall. That the only thing they want to talk about is, this celebrity, that celebrity. Oh, by the way, did you know that so-and-so got in a slight fender bender, but he's okay, so you can feel good today. And it's just like, I don't care. Honest to God, I don't care. Every celebrity, well, I was going to say every celebrity on the face of the planet could die today, and I wouldn't care. They're not doing anything for us,
Yes, I do know. But there are ways to manipulate the media. Again, I have a theater background. Before that, my first career was in broadcasting. So I know how these people think. I know what we're up against. And at the same time, they will pay attention if enough noise gets made in a particular way, because they will have to. Maybe not everybody. I do not expect Fox to come out and cover it. I do not expect, certain publications to do anything except denigrate it. Forbes in particular, you'll never get a straight story about nuclear out of Forbes, because Jeff Forbes, the owner, is deeply invested in nuclear technology. So his publication exists to waft away your fears so you pay no attention.
Right.
But it is important that those of us who understand what this is and the danger of it make the noise as much as possible.
Right.
For example, I don't know if you need to take a break at the hour, but if you do,
we're coming
on the
up.
other side,
We're coming up on it yet. We haven't got there yet.
Okay, but I'll wait until the other side of that to get into what's been happening at San Onofre, because, like I said, 3 of my last 4 programs have been focused almost exclusively on the events that are happening there, and it's pretty terrifying because we almost lost Southern California. But this happens all the time, and we don't find out about things except by accident, by whistleblower, by somebody taking readings at a time that proves inconvenient for the nuclear industry. And we go, but wait a minute, but this is over here. Now, and unfortunately, the issues are so complex that it's hard for people to follow them.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Libbe. Sorry. We're going to come right back after the break. So everybody hang tight. We'll be back here in a couple of minutes. Libbe, before we keep going on, why don't you go and give out your contact information where people can find you and read the research and stuff and listen to the show?
They can find me at nuclearhotseat.com. That is where I post a new show every week, sometime between Tuesday and Wednesday, depending on your time zone. And it also has an archive of over 370 programs there for you to be able to access. We're also on iTunes. But if you go to the website and scroll down, there's a yellow box, and it's an opt-in box. You put in your first name and your email address, and I will send you every week a link to the program with just a short description of what's in it. I don't bother you. I don't bug you. It's not one of these, you get hit with all of these promotional emails. You just get one, but it's got the information. And in that way, you never lose an episode of Nuclear Hot Seat. So again, that's at nuclearhotseat.com. And the other thing I want to remind your listeners about is that my book is published as of yesterday. It's called Yes, I Glow in the Dark, 1 Mile from 3 Mile Island to Fukishima and a Nuclear Hot Seat. And if you go to Amazon, that's where it's available, and you just write in, Yes, I Glow in the Dark, it will take you to the page, and that's where you'll see it. We've got the book available now. The ebook was supposed to be available, but there were some formatting glitches. That will be available as of next week. And okay, I hope you read it because it will explain a lot of the background to help you understand on your own what's going on with nuclear issues.
Well, the reviews have been pretty good from what I've read so far, so... But,
I mean, I have to say that when Dr. Helen Caldecott said, I sent her an advance copy, and she said, absolutely fascinating. This book must be read by all people who care about the future of the planet and their children. It's kind of like, okay, fine, I can die happy now. It's like the goddess Athena came down and said, okay, kid, you passed muster.
Yeah, you got the little gold star in your forehead.
Yeah, that felt really good to get.
All right. So anyway, go ahead and pick up where you left off at the break there.
Okay, San Onofre. This is a complex of, there were originally 3 reactors. One of them's been like cold and shut down for a long time. We don't have to worry about that. But there were 2 that were in operation, and Southern California Edison, the operators, this is a little bit of backstory on this, tried to jury-rig the steam generators without getting approval for a new design from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because they were trying to squeeze more energy out of it, and it turned out to be a deeply flawed design, and it ended up with pipes cracking and leaking radiation, which Edison managed to forget to or avoid telling the public for 17 days until they were nailed by outside sources. So Edison does not want to come clean on its issue, and it was the revelation of these of this leak, this faulty design, that led to the permanent shutdown of San Onofre. Edison likes to say, oh, it was for economic purposes. No, it was because they were deeply flawed. They tried to get away with something. Okay, so now we're stuck with the problem that every nuclear reactor has, which is all the years of radioactive waste that have been created. All the spent fuel rods, which you think something's spent, it's dead, it's null, it's void. It's not. This is stuff that is still highly radioactive, highly dangerous, filled with weapons-grade plutonium. That's the waste stream is weapons-grade plutonium, or what can be converted into weapons-grade plutonium very easily, which is why these things are so dangerous. And they have to be kept underwater in what's called a spent fuel pool for long enough, for usually at least 5 years, until they're cool enough to be put into dry casks. Well, Edison, and I can't get into all of the manipulations, but they got approval to put fuel rods into dry casks and store them on site, underground. Here are the problems. Number one, these are the cheapest, least reliable casks out there by a company named Holtec. These casks are only 5/8 of an inch stainless steel between us and all that radioactivity. The contents are radioactive for 24,000 years, the half-life. They're really radioactive for 20 times that, so it's 480,000 years that this stuff is dangerous. The canisters are only rated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as being usable and safe to use for 25 years before they have to be replaced. And we know that in a saltwater environment, this 5/8 of an inch stainless steel has been known to crack within 17, 18 years. And once they crack, that crack goes all the way through. You now have millions of REMs, millions of units of radiation leaking out. There's no way to monitor these canisters. They're like tin cans. Once they're sealed, they're sealed. They can't be reopened. They cannot be removed from where they are being stored and transported elsewhere. So basically, painted into a corner. Now, get the picture. Where are these being stored? San Onofre is right up against one of the most beautiful beaches and one of the best surfing beaches in Southern California. The high tide level, they got a tsunami wall or a tide wall there, is within 17 feet of the plant, is where high tide comes under normal circumstances. We're not talking about storm surge. We're not talking about possible tsunami. It's also an earthquake zone. There's a major earthquake. There are several major earthquake faults. One is only 5 miles away, and that's capable of creating a water surge. So all of this is at tremendous risk. Now, since Holtec and Southern California Edison have at lightning speed, I mean, they just want to get this done, out and over, and get out of there with their money, because the ratepayers are paying for this right now. The Southern California Edison ratepayers, not their shareholders. It's not coming out of shareholders. They're making lots of bucks off of this. But the ratepayers are paying for it. Since they started, the first 4 canisters, which were already loaded in, can't move it, have already been found to have flaws in them that cannot be corrected. They can't pull them out. They can't transport them anywhere. They have no facility for removing the spent fuel rods from there. So basically, we're painted into a corner with those. In the 5th one that they tried to load, we found a broken bolt. You don't want to broken anything on something that's supposed to contain material that is that dangerous. So they said, oh, well, we're putting in a new design. They now have 29 canisters in. Now, this whole thing started speeding up when about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Gregory Yasko, he was the head during Fukishima, and he came out in favor of safety, which is why the nuclear industry has blackballed him. He is unemployable within the nuclear industry, where most of these guys go on to multi-million-dollar jobs. But he was interviewed for a program on, KPBS in San Francisco. And I have his quote here. He said, he was talking about the dry casks that were being loaded at San Onofre. We call them tin cans because they're the thin canisters. Yasko said, quite frankly, once they get loaded, I don't see them ever taking those canisters out of there. Realistically, they're not going to move them out. So those permits will be extended. The operational period will be extended on indefinitely, and you will have a de facto burial site there. There's a tendency to want to make the problem go away emotionally and mentally, and when you bury things, it's easier to mentally not worry about them. Very quickly, people come to this conclusion that the way that you solve this problem is you find a place where you can bury and forget. It's literally called bury and forget because you bury the waste and you forget about it. But of course, that doesn't take away the damage that it's doing. So this story came out on August 2nd and was quite a thing. Now, A week ago yesterday, it was Thursday, August, whatever it was. I think it was August 9th. There was a meeting on San Onofre with the California Public Utilities Commission. They're called public engagement panels, but really what we call them is public enragement panels because they're so terrible. And they're so manipulated and all of that. And it was going along in its usual manipulated way, and it was a time for people from the audience to get up, and now you get to have 3 minutes to speak. And some guy who nobody had ever seen before walked up and he said his name. He said, I work at the San Onofre site, not the nuclear stuff. I do OSHA, or at least I have worked up there till now. But after I say what I have to say tonight, I may not have a job tomorrow. And at that point, everybody's cell phone cameras went on and went, oh, we got to record this guy. It's a whistleblower. And he was saying that on Friday, August 3rd, there was a near miss at San Onofre where a fully loaded canister was in the process of being loaded into one of these tubes where it's supposed to be held. And it was mishandled. It went askew. And it slipped, and it was caught by a lip. It's supposed to be a guide lip. A 1/4-inch lip was the only thing that kept this thing from falling 18 feet. And I mean, this guy was shaking. His voice was cracking. He was putting his entire career, his livelihood, everything on the line because, as he said, I told my daughter, he has a 12-year-old daughter, he said, I told my daughter that I was going to come here tonight and listen. And if Southern California Edison did not say anything, did not bring up the fact that this had happened, I was going to step forward and say something. And this is a man of high ethical and moral standing, and he kept his word to his daughter. So we found out, and here's the horrifying part of it. We're like going nuts. And Tom Palmisano, who is the chief nuclear officer for Southern California Edison, obviously had a cheat sheet in front of him, and he starts giving the talking points to handle what was being said. And he's doing it in a particularly mannered way that I recognize as neurolinguistic programming, which is a very manipulative way of proceeding with information, okay, NLP. And so he was ready to handle it in case it came out. But Edison, just like they held out on telling us that there was a radiation leak for 17 days back when it was the steam generator pipes that were malfunctioning that ended up taking it down, they hid the information for 17 days. They were perfectly willing to hide this. They'd already hidden it for 6 days, and they would have continued to do so if this one brave individual hadn't stepped forward. And there is now, the last time I knew, there was a huge fundraising campaign to raise the money to get the attorneys to be able to have an injunction against them, because Edison is moving ahead and saying, oh, it was just a little training problem. We've got to give these guys more training. It was just a little. And the media, I mean, we're talking about the LA Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, which are the two big newspapers closest by that should be covering this. Right. They went for the party line. What they don't understand is that each of these containers has within it is somewhere between 30 and 110,000 pounds of material. In this particular case, what was cited that I heard was 38,000 pounds of radioactive material held in a tin can made out of, stainless steel, 5/8 of an inch thick, could have fallen 18 feet. Chernobyl, to this day, 32 years after the accident, requires a 50-mile exclusion zone around it where nobody is allowed to live or work there unless they have something specifically to do with it. Just
I want to make clear to the people who are listening, if this thing had fallen 18 feet and had cracked open, I mean, because I understand how fuel rods work when they're in conjunction with each other. I mean, they superheat themselves, which is how nuclear reactors work. But in San Onofre, this thing falls 18 feet. It cracks open because the metal is now brittle because of the radiation. In what you know about it, what do you think would have been the end result of this? Not so much the end result, but what do you think would have been the chain reaction? Start from that point and work your way up.
Oh, it would have been a chain reaction. First of all, if you have any familiarity with the San Diego freeway, that is a parking lot on most days. Anytime you get near, the time when people are commuting to or from work.
And what is that? What is that like? Not even like 100 yards away from the reactors themselves, or maybe just a little bit more.
I can't give you the direct thing, but let's just say you drive by and the reactors are right there to your right. I mean, it's kind of like, it's like there's the ocean. Oh, look, between the ocean and me, here are the twin concrete stand-ins for really over-augmented women's breasts.
Well, yeah, they're called the Dolly Partons for a reason.
I got another name for them, but I won't use them here. But in any event, you asked me what would have happened. Okay, first of all, if and when word got out, and we know from 3 Mile Island, the people from the facility leave first and take their families with them before they let anybody know. So that would have been the first step. But once people found out, it would have been madness, because there's only one road, the 405 freeway, that goes through there, which is 4 lanes in each direction. So you would have had that bottleneck. You would have had people further away trying to get away. And if you think of this in terms of a 50-mile radius for evacuation and exclusion zone, as was done at Chernobyl, that includes Camp Pendleton, which would have become unusable. We've got a quote from a very high-ranking military man saying, if anything goes wrong at San Onofre, Pendleton is lost. We've got the port of Long Beach, which is one of the largest ports in the United States, and it's the portal through which imported goods come from all over the Pacific Rim and all of those countries. Come on, 42 miles away, it's Disneyland. And all the corporations and all the businesses and all the most expensive real estate in Southern California on the bluffs overlooking the tax. It's like it would destroy the economy of California, and certainly Southern California.
You also have to remember that the Port of Long Beach also houses our ships from the Navy, too.
Mm-hmm.
So, they're done.
But there would, of course, be the attempt at a cover-up because of all of these things. The only people who are making noise about this are us. Those of us who have dedicated our lives, some of these people for many decades more than I have been involved, certainly, to finding out the truth, schooling ourselves on things that we never really wanted to learn about. If I hadn't been at 3 Mile Island, I wouldn't be paying any attention to this. But I was. I got recruited, so I'm in. But I'm only in now for about 7.5 years. We are doing everything in our power to let people understand, and it's starting to filter out because everybody's heard, isn't there something happening down at San Onofre? And I talk about it all the time. We do what we can, and that's why it's important to have programs such as yours where this truth can be discussed. If there are any people in Southern California, I would urge you, first of all, to go to Nuclear Hot Seat, and if nothing else, listen to this week's show, which is number 373, because that's the full-length special, and it includes the whistleblower speaking, which, strange but true, the live stream just happened to drop out for about 30 seconds when he was saying some of his most damning information, and I had to piece it together from cell phone audios. Right. But his entire thing is there. But you will get a sense of what's there, and then call your legislators, tell people, let them know they are playing with our lives and our future there. Because once they have 79 of these Chernobyl's worth of radiation canisters loaded in, which is what they are rushing to do, they're going to tear down everything else so you don't see it. They're going to take away the spent fuel pool. So if anything goes wrong there, they don't even have any place to put it temporarily, not let alone that there's no way to pull them out. There's no way to move them. We have no it's called a hot cell, which is where you unpack packed fuel canisters like this. And the ocean is right there. We've got the prevailing wind. What would happen to our agriculture, our water, our population, our health, our economy? And then it just keeps blowing over the country because it's not like it goes up to the border of California and goes, oh, we have to stop here. This stuff is there. And it doesn't go away.
This is almost like making Space 1999. If anybody remembers that old TV show, seemed like a possibility, you know. Except it's happening here because we can't move all that stuff to the moon.
We have painted ourselves into a nuclear corner. And the thing is, the paint is not going to go away, and there is no way out. And they are removing even the vaguest possibility of a way out. So
right.
if the people behind this wanted to destroy the United States, wanted to destroy Southern California, they could think of no better way to do it. So what I call them is they are burying dirty bombs on the beach. And Southern California Edison, in my estimation, along with Holtec, along with complicitly the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, these are terrorist organizations because they are allowing the burial of dirty bombs on the beach at San Onofre with no way to take them out.
Right, and not even just that, but let's move in even to a little bit somewhere else, which is nuclear waste storage. And you want to talk about Yucca Mountain, and I know there's been a big pushback in Nevada about that. And the federal government, which of course a lot of them are paid off by the nuclear energy providers anyway in Congress, I have no doubt about that. But they're saying, no, well, this is the only way to store our nuclear waste. And if you look at some of the x-rays on some of those things, everybody's going to think, there's big chunks of spent nuclear rods and big chunks of nuclear rocks or whatever. I'm looking at clothing, wrenches, anything that's metal that can absorb the kind of radiation that you need, that you get from working around nuclear facilities and whatever. Those are being stuck in these canisters and stuck under Yucca Mountain. And it's like a giant nuclear bed for whatever. At the same time, they're putting all that stuff in there. They're taking depleted uranium and they're sticking it into ammunition that our military is using, and they're shooting that stuff off. And the rationale that our government uses and the weapons manufacturers use is that this is the only thing that we have that can penetrate the kind of armor that's coming up, because the way it concentrates the energy. And Dr. Rocky, who was in charge of at one point trying to clean up the DU out of the Middle East, is saying there's no way it can be done. The only way you want to even curtail any of this is you have to stop using it.
Yeah.
But it's become that the U.S. military, at some point, we've become a waste disposal system. So I don't mean to say we, but I was in the military. The U.S. military has become a waste disposal system for the nuclear, even the energy companies, the ones who are using the uranium, at least anyway.
Well, the thing about nuclear materials is that there's no way. There's no way to get rid of them. There is no way to neutralize them, no known way to neutralize them. And even if you store them, after a period of time, the materials that are storing the radioactive material, they themselves become radioactive and need to be contained by other materials, which over time become radioactive. That's what happened at Chernobyl. They put up the initial sarcophagus, but their engineers said, look, this thing is only going to be good for about 30 years, and then it's going to start to decay, and we're going to be in the same problem all over again. And right on schedule, it started to decay. They were at least smart enough over there that they started building this enormous, they call it the new safe containment structure, but this enormous building around Chernobyl. It cost billions of dollars. Ukraine had to go to the EU for finishing funds because Russia stepped back from it when the politics went south. And that's only good for 100 years, and they're going to have to build one that's bigger than that. It's like the nesting dolls that they've got in Russia, only this is like nuclear nesting dolls, and there's no end to it. So getting back to Yucca Mountain, it is not usable for a number of reasons. and we're not even going into the ethics and the morals of the fact that they stole the land from the Western Shoshone people, who consider this part of their sacred land, in order to dig the thing. But it is built on top of, it is in an earthquake zone. It is on top of porous soil, meaning anything liquid can flow through it, above the largest aquifer in the country. It's called variously either the Oglala aquifer or the High Plains aquifer. It underlies 8 states, and it is the largest aquifer that we've got, the largest source of fresh water we've got in the United States. Anything happens radiologically that comes in contact with water at Yucca, should they be storing something there, would eventually seep down and begin the contamination process of this aquifer. In addition to which, one of the things they're not talking about, Yucca was built to take 75,000 tons. I know the figure is 75,000, but let's just say 75,000 tons of radioactive material. In the spent fuel ponds around this country, we already have more than 82,000. So it's not big enough to handle what we've already created, and we create more every day. So the first step, like you say, don't use those weapons. The first step is turn off those nukes, and let's put all the money that is being manipulated by the industry and by the politicians and the lobbyists to support nuclear. Take that money and give it to genuine renewables and retrain the nuclear workforce to work in renewables. And in that way, we, they say, oh, well, what do you do with solar when the sun doesn't shine? What do you do with wind when the wind doesn't blow? Well, we're seeing this year yet again, and even more than usual, the problem of in summer, when the water that's supposed to be used to cool nuclear reactors becomes too warm, which with global warming, it is warming up, they can't cool the reactors. So the reactors have to either power back or shut down completely. In addition to which, with global warming, as the polar ice caps melt, sea level is rising. There are nuclear reactors all up and down the east coast of the United States. We don't have as many. We've got San Onofre and Diablo Canyon here in California, but they are all over. They're butt to cheek against each other, all up and down the east coast. And with the rise of sea level, they're going to start inundating these plants with water, which means that they're not going to be able to take in water to cool because the mechanisms are going to be underwater, and that's not how they're meant to operate. Nuclear reactors also do not generate their own electricity. They have to be connected to the grid. And if anything goes down with grid energy, which is what happened at Fukushima and what caused it, it switches over to diesel generators for emergency power. But usually they have no more than, about 5 to 7 days worth of diesel on hand in order to power those things. They won't be able to cool the reactors. And then all of those reactors that have been flooded out are going to go into the same kind of meltdown potential situation that happened with Fukushima, where there were 3 simultaneous meltdowns. So, I mean, it's like if somebody wanted to mine the harbor, wanted to mine the United States with nuclear bombs, dirty bombs maybe they're not going to explode, but they sure can let off an awful lot of radiation. If they wanted to do that, could do no better job than what they've already done. And now they're playing the end game, because once the fuel is in at San Onofre, they're going to take everything else down and walk away with it, wipe their hands, and walk away with their millions, if not billions, of dollars. And the same everywhere else, because we're seeing this play out. It's the game plan of the industry. And there are funds for decommissioning that have been saved through ratepayer and local consumers and taxes and things like that, to build a fund of money to pay for decommissioning. But when these reactors get close to their decommissioning, the companies that own them are selling it to other companies to dismantle them, where there are legal tricks in there where these guys aren't really that responsible. But the money gets transferred over to them. They do a quick and dirty job, walk away with the profits, and move to New Zealand or go to a bunker condo in the middle of an old missile silo in the western part of the United States and wait until everything calms down after it all goes to blazes.
Right. I mean, it just seems like they built these things, and at some point somebody said, what could really go wrong? I mean, and somebody else in the background at some point said, hold my beer.
Mm-hmm.
This is what can go wrong. And it has.
We don't even know. Yeah.
And anybody who said anything about it was immediately discredited. I mean, that's the when it comes to whistleblowers, that's the modus operandi is the second somebody says something, hey, this can go very wrong. Well, number one, we're going to yank all your scientific credentials that you worked for all those years, and all those laurels that you attained over the years. Those mean nothing. And when something does go wrong, somebody else is saying like, we tried to warn them. Well, your scientific credentials are yanked, and any laurels that you got, they're completely gone, and you're no longer can work in a university because you're nuts. So it just seems like, this is not an isolated thing. This is a systemic thing, and these energy producing companies are doing everything they can to make sure that anybody who blows the whistle on them, because now they can get away with it a little bit easier. The internet's a little bit it's actually starting to close in a little bit. If we've seen some of the censorship that's going on, but I mean, during the days when somebody like Karen Silkwood came out and started saying, hey, something's really going on bad here. I mean, taking her out was not that much of an issue. But, it just seems like now it's become, especially when you had something like Chernobyl and they tried to sweep that under the rug, and a lot of people are just like, yeah, well, it's in Russia. Who cares? They built their things shoddy there anyway. But, and then we had Fukushima, which had its meltdown, and that's starting to sweep around. And you had things like San Onofre, which they tried to sweep under the rug, but that didn't happen. And, at some point, at what point are these whistleblowers going to be not, I don't know what the opposite of vilified is, but when are they going to be exonerated, I guess would be the best term.
I think it's a matter of getting people beyond their denial and beyond their fear, because we're dealing with some ultimate issues here. I have to be very careful among my friends that I don't open my mouth and then watch their eyes glaze over as I'm trying to tell them something. Some of my friends want to hear this, and we get into great conversations, and with others, it's let's do anything but. And I have to respect that, because people can only be where they are. But more and more people are waking up to the fact that there are so many things that are going wrong in so many directions that you need to take action. And, I'd love everybody who's hearing this to become some level of an anti-nuclear activist and help us solve these problems and bring feet to the fire and pressure to bear and all of the other cliches, but the things that we have to do to get the nuclear industry and its completely captured regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which, by the way, this will blow your mind, receives 90% of its funding from the nuclear industry.
Of course. Of course they do.
So the last thing they want is for all these reactors closed down, because then they have to shrink the agency and they won't have their cushy jobs. And I'm sure there are lots of other manipulations in there as well. But it is, we're playing with eternity here, because what isn't explained is what ionizing radiation, the kind of radiation that comes off of a functioning nuclear reactor or a bomb, what that does, or uranium, what that does to human DNA. We are talking about the blueprint of the fractal of human life that allows us to reproduce, with 10 fingers and 10 toes and everything in operating behavior, and the potential for, a good long life of, 70, if not well beyond that. Well, that's going away, because there's a thing, and I read about this in the book because this is brand new, that it's not just the diseases that will show up in somebody who has been exposed to nuclear radiation. It is the damage to their DNA, which may not express itself immediately. It may not express itself in the person whose life has been there, such as myself. I never had children, and 3 Mile Island is one of the reasons why I decided that. But with exposure to radiation, if it dings your DNA, it may show up in the next generation as a birth defect, as a mutation, as a miscarriage, as an anything. Or the child may appear to be healthy, but now they've got a recessive gene that carries this particular piece of damage. And if they end up mating with somebody else who has that same recessive, it then becomes dominant and the disease expresses itself, which is why around 3 Mile Island, while there were many children who were ill, but there were many children who did not appear to be ill. But as they grew up and they married, and now we're into the grandchild generation, we're finding extensive damage and illness in the grandchildren. Everybody's everybody's a critic.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen the some of the research that's done on the I guess what they called them was the children of Chernobyl?
Oh, that's Eddie Roche's charity, Chernobyl Children International, I think it's called. She's based in Ireland, and she's the one who helps those children every year, a certain group of them, and it's a different group every year, that helps them to come up to Ireland, so at least they're in an uncontaminated environment for a while. And they're the ones who do show the pictures. So they say, oh, those pictures are too upsetting to show. We can't show them. No, it's time to show the upsetting pictures because this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. We cannot be complicit in the silence, no matter how upsetting these pictures are. And I've seen those. I have seen pictures and films from after Hiroshima and after Nagasaki, and they are stomach-turning. They are heart-wrenching. They are the documents of abomination done by members of the human species to their own kind. And it's horrific. And this is what we're facing. This is what we are facing, is this kind of annihilation happening everywhere.
Well, and everybody, what the thing that really kind of got me with the pictures of all the kids that came out of Chernobyl, after one generation of people being exposed to it, a lot of people are saying, well, and this was not, if anybody bothers to look at it, this was not just, your random kind of birth effects. I mean, this was systemic through the people that lived around that area. And some of them were just like birth effects that you had probably never even seen before. And some of the research on it that was done on it was this damage was not even anything that you've seen here in the United States, where it's like, okay, that happens once in a while. This was genetic damage that they had never seen before. I mean, this was kind of on a genetic where, DNA was being like ripped apart and reorganized in ways that there were, some of these scientists and medical doctors were just going like, we have no idea what this is. This is all brand new. This is the kind of damage that radiation does. I mean, you pick up a chunk of uranium, you're going to get a burn on your leg and you'll probably develop cancer there or whatever. But this is something that's going to be passed down for generations. I mean, you can't. People just don't understand or don't get what's going on with it, and what the birth effects that they have been seeing in Fallujah, especially, which is now like a nuclear wasteland at this point. The children that have been coming out of there from generations that came afterwards.
The doctors there actually tell young women in Fallujah and the surrounding area, do not have children, because there's no way to guarantee that they will be genetically healthy, that they will even be able to be born. And of course, if one has, this is one of the terrible tragedies after Chernobyl, is not only does a child who is born with, and these are horrific mutations, not only is it them, but the children live and the family is tasked with taking care of them, and it absolutely destroys the lives of everyone around them as well. Nothing that we think of as normal and usual in terms of the orderly flow and progression of human life is possible in the aftermath of this exposure. Not that it happens immediately and that's how they get away with it, but over time, over generations, over decades, this expresses itself, and it just gets more and more intense. I mean, all of the allergies that are out there, all of the new autoimmune diseases, all of the weird things that we don't really have names for yet, that are syndromes, that are, this is one of the things I learned about when I went back to 3 Mile Island for this last event. A woman there from Beyond Nuclear, Cindy Folkers, she's not a hands-on researcher, but she takes the research and she translates it so that normal people can understand what it's saying. And she's been doing this for 25 years. She said that they've now discovered that there is the genetic impact of a subclinical impact, meaning it doesn't show up immediately as an illness. You can't, you couldn't look at me and say, oh, well, your adrenals are going to give out in 25 years. And by the way, if you have children, they'll not only have that, they'll have X, Y, Z, A, B, C going on as well. And I knew about the possibility of mutation, and I made the conscious decision not to have children because I couldn't have done it. I simply could not have done it if I had a child who had those needs. That's not me. And it terrified me. So
right.
We're seeing, and now we are seeing the impact, but nobody's tracing it back to where it came from, in part because we didn't learn about radiation at the time when we should have, which was immediately after the bomb, because William Lawrence, who won a Pulitzer for this 10-article series, didn't say anything about the mutagenic nature of exposure to nuclear radiation and the devastation that it was wreaking upon the Japanese people.
Right, and it's not even just, sorry if I can just interrupt, but it's not even just with the radiation, it's with all this other stuff that they're doing, because this multi-pronged attack that we seem to be getting, excuse me, GMO, all the GMO foods, all the other stuff that they're putting in the air and the water and everything else. Plus, you got the radiation coming in, and the big excuse from all these gigantic corporate conglomerates are just, worldwide, are just saying like, well, nothing's happened to you, so obviously nothing has happened. There hasn't been enough generational mutation for anything to happen yet. Except for radiation, because we've seen it happen with what happened in Japan and what happened in Chernobyl at this point, and they're still denying that it's happened.
Even worse, they're denying that it happened at 3 Mile Island, and they've covered it up completely, because that is a community of people who were not only traumatized by the accident, but then they were propagandized afterwards into saying, nothing to see here, move along. And they've been living their lives. When I was there, most people just kind of made a joke out of it, saying, oh, yeah, well, I sent my dog out of town, but my husband and I stayed here, or telling cute little anecdotes. But if you ask them about the health impact, everybody shut down, shut up, wouldn't look you in the eye, moved away, changed the subject. And the few people who were willing to talk about it, they would only do it talk to me over on one side, quietly, their voices low, telling me about loved ones who had died and how they suspected it was 3 Mile Island, but they couldn't prove it.
Libbe,
that's how badly. Yeah?
I want to say this very quickly. Approximately 30 to 35 years ago, I attended a professional symposium, and the presenter mentioned that at that time, these canisters filled with nuclear waste were being dumped in the Atlantic Ocean. Do you have any information about that?
Not that specifically. I do know that there were canisters of nuclear waste from Hunters Point in San Francisco that were taken by barge off the coast of San Francisco and dumped there. Some of them were floating and they wanted them to sink, so they shot them with guns so that they would sink. That was great. So I can speak to that.
Oh my
but
God.
Realize nuclear is such a hydra-headed monster and shows up in so many places that I don't know that it's possible for any one individual to hold on to all of the details and all of the stories. I'm a generalist in that I seek out and compile the information and try to make it available to people so that somebody like me coming in from the outside has a fighting chance of understanding it. And hopefully I have attained at least somewhat that level of clarity tonight for your listeners.
Okay, well,
when it comes...
At that time, that was standard procedure apparently for disposing of nuclear waste, and the fellow who presented was very concerned because he said these canisters, as you pointed out, in corrosive salt water where they're going to be dumped, are only going to last so long. And you have the Gulf Stream there on the Atlantic coast. What's that going to do to the northern Atlantic Ocean and Europe?
And everything. I mean, there's no place that hasn't been hit. When all of those atmospheric nuclear tests were being done, and there were over 2,100 of them around the world that were being done, each one of those shot radiation up into the jet stream, where the particulate radioactive material still circles the planet. Now, in order for a raindrop to form, it's up there in whatever that level is of the stratosphere or whatever it is. Raindrops have to form around particulate matter. And if some of it happens to be radioactive, the drop forms, it comes to Earth as either rain or snow, and all of a sudden you've got a radiation spike someplace that it makes no sense. Well, that's called a rainout. And so any place can have a rainout. So nobody's immune from this. Fracking gets this out. Uranium mining lets this out. We've got what Fukishima's been doing to the Pacific Ocean, and now we're getting further word, I've been tracking this through the years, that there are certain species, certain types of salmon up in Alaska where the stock has completely collapsed. And these are fish that swim out in the Pacific. Once they're spawned, they go down and into the ocean. And they swim for 5 to 7 years while they're growing and maturing. But their migration patterns bring them close to Japan and through the waters. The same thing with sea bass, with cod, with the other fish, that they are swimming through this. And with the salmon, in coming back, these are the fish that were exposed 7 years ago to the first amounts of radiation coming out into the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima. And a lot of them aren't managing to get back, and some of them that are, I'm still tracking down this story. I want to talk to the individual, but there's somebody up in Alaska who's been taking radiation meterings, and he said that in his readings, the fish have tested higher than a friend of his who was in radiation treatment for cancer. So,
yeah, that sounds about right.
And there's no government follow-up because the government doesn't want statistics, because if there are no statistics, nothing can be proven.
Well,
so
because they're being paid off by the nuclear industry. I mean, that's kind of a given at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But since we're pretty close to getting to the end of here, I just wanted to ask this because we've been discussing all this, the health effects of anything. Since you were at 3 Mile Island and since then, what have you noticed any ill effects in yourself because of it?
I noticed ill effects, but it took me until after Fukushima, when I was going through some treatment for my adrenal glands. I was exhausted all the time. It would take me 3 naps to get through the day, and brain fog and all the rest. And I was doing dietary manipulation. And nothing was working until I read a book about adrenal exhaustion, and it asked the question, when can you remember the last time that you felt completely healthy? And I thought about it, and it was right before 3 Mile Island. And that shocked me. And then as I started going through some very esoteric but very profound healing work with an acupuncturist herbalist who starts with blood work, and then we worked our way through, I've managed to regain, I would say, about 70 to 80% of my adrenal function. So as long as I'm careful, I can pretty much live the kind of active life that I want. I can't do the outrageous things and push myself. If I push myself, I go into deficit. But I thought that in part that was because I had had such an emotional reaction when the event happened that set me up for the deterioration of my adrenal glands. It was only after this last trip to 3 Mile Island when I sat and talked with Cindy Folkers of Beyond Nuclear for an extended period of time, and she told me about the subclinical impact. I probably, and again, there's no way to prove this, but I believe that there was some kind of subclinical impact on me that expressed itself through my adrenals. And realized I was only there for the first 3 days of the accident. We then evacuated out and came back, and I was there for at most another 24 to 36 hours, and then I was out. So I had no residual exposure to whatever radiation may have landed, on the ground, in the water, on the crops, in the milk. I was away from there. The people who were there have been under constant bombardment of whatever's left. I cannot speak to it because I don't know the details on it. I don't know if anybody has done the research, been able to get the money for the research on those details. But in my case, it expressed itself in my adrenals, which of course kicked my thyroid, and a lot of exhaustion, a lot of being tired, a lot of not being able to live the life that I wanted to live, in addition to which, in the wake of it, weighing the difficulty of risking giving birth to a child with, some kind of horrific birth defect or adding it into the genetic downline. I took my body offline as something to have children, not this life, not this body. So those were the direct impacts upon me.
Well, when you went to the doctor, did they ever do a check to find out if the radiation levels in your body were higher? I mean, because I know that they do this with thyroid patients. They give them like these radioactive pills and everything, so the radiation immediately increases in their body. But did they ever check you for that?
No, I wouldn't. I would never have allowed that. I have spent my life since then, first of all, living as organic and holistic a life as I can. I will not expose myself to radiation if I can help it. Even dental x-rays. It's all cumulative. Radiation accumulates in your body. There's no such thing as an innocent dose. No, I did not have that done because I didn't know what was wrong with me, and I wanted to ignore all things nuclear.
Okay. I didn't want them to expose you to more radiation. I was just wondering if they did a test where if they knew that there was any more in you than normal, some of the stuff that may have stuck there.
No, at that time, people in California were so ignorant about anything nuclear happening at 3 Mile Island, they forgot about it almost immediately. And even if I went in for a health exam and I mentioned this, it bore no weight because there was no subtlety, there was no understanding of what it might mean. So as far as they were concerned, it didn't mean anything. There was nothing to check, and it was all in my head. And everybody knows that, nobody died at 3 Mile Island. I'll leave you with this. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. Right. Nobody dropped dead at the facility. But did people die from 3 Mile Island? That's a whole other discussion. And the answer is yeah. And plenty of them did. And it's still happening.
Yeah, but they don't want to link all that together.
No, of course not. But work is being done. People are talking to each other. Who knows where this is going? But I know that people are waking up. And going back to my book is a wake-up call, and it's a call to action. But it's cleverly disguised as, here's a story of a woman who went through this experience, and she dealt with show business. And look at all these names she's mentioning, and look at Broadway, look at Hollywood, look at network television. So stuff like that is sprinkled through, but a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. And ultimately, this is a heaping big amount of medicine for people to know about. So I can refresh people's memories, I want you to write this down because I think you'll get a lot out of it. It's called Yes, I Glow in the Dark, 1 mile from 3 Mile Island to Fukishima and nuclear hockey. But just remember, Yes, I Glow in the Dark. It's on Amazon. It's available. It went live yesterday. And it will give you a lot of information, not only what we talked about here, but tons of other things. But it's couched in such a way, it's like the show. When I do Nuclear Hot Seat, it is, I go for humor wherever I can. I have jingles. I used to write musical theater, so I've got some very nicely written jingles that are in the show. I have a weekly feature called Numbnuts of the Week for nuclear boneheadedness, which is the dumbest thing I can find that the nuclear industry has done. And every week there are multiple possibilities for that. And I do everything I can to make the information understandable and palatable. I am sarcastic. I will use funny voices. I will use sound effects. I will use anything I can, because the goal is to just keep people listening so that you're not going to remember all of it, but maybe you'll hear something that relates to you or someone you love that will give you a key to understanding. You mean the reason that 5 people in this family all got cancer was because they lived in an area that was close to a nuclear reactor or that was contaminated by nuclear waste, as is the case in North St. Louis, or that, they were around uranium mines, or all the different ways that we can be exposed to this stuff that we don't bother to think about. I want people to think about it and just consider it. If you don't have any of this in your life, you have been blessed. And at the same time, if you think you don't have any of this in your life, you may be wrong.
I think you're probably wrong, but that also leads me to one other question. Do you actually glow in the dark?
That's like saying, what does a chameleon see when it looks in the mirror? As far as somebody else would have to tell me that, but hopefully this book is so incendiary that it's going to put the show. I'm expecting bulk buys from all of the nuclear industry, because they're going to read this and go, I've already got a troll on my site too. It's very funny. I'm playing with her like mad. But it's like, have you worked in this industry? Have you been trained in nuclear? It's kind of like, no, honey, I learned it all on my feet because I had to. And I'm so sorry that you drank the Kool-Aid, and I hope you can find peace with yourself, because if I were you, I certainly couldn't. Wow, her brains exploded. So anyway, I hope people will take the time to check out Nuclear Hot Seat, because, as I say every week, we are all in the Nuclear Hot Seat.
It's a great website. What? I've been there. I've looked at it. It's I recommend that everybody go check it out. But before we wind up going off the air here in a couple of minutes, I think go ahead and give out your information again, your website and your Amazon and your book and everything else.
The website is Nuclear Hot Seat, HOTSEAT.com. And the book is Yes, I Glow in the Dark. And you'll find it on Amazon. Just put that in, search it. It's available now. And the ebook will be available next week when we get our formatting problems cleared up. And thank you so much for your support.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was Libbe HaLevy on our show. And we'll see you everybody next week.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.